first presentation is entitled Puppets in Wonderland, Developing Mounts for Alice in Wonderland Marionette Puppets to Create an Animated Atmosphere and Showcase the Puppets' Performative Past. Carmela Lonetti is Objects Conservator at Arts Centre Melbourne. She cares for the Australian Performing Arts Collection and Public Art Collection. Prior to her current role, Carmela worked for several years as an object conservator at the Grimwald Centre for Cultural Materials Conservation, Commercial Services at the University of Melbourne. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Carmela Lonetti. I'm an objects conservator at the Arts Centre Melbourne in Australia. Thank you to the IMF for the opportunity to be here today. My presentation is about... My presentation is about a display I helped put together earlier this year called Puppets in Wonderland. At Arts Centre Melbourne, we look after the Australian Performing Arts Collection, which is dedicated to the collection, preservation and interpretation of Australia's circus, dance, music, opera and theatre heritage. Arts Centre Melbourne is predominantly a performing arts centre, and this display coincided with the Australian Ballet season of Alice in Wonderland. The puppets in this display were used by the Pilgrim Puppet Theatre in their 1978 production of Alice in Wonderland. The Pilgrim Puppet Theatre established itself in a former church building on the outskirts of Melbourne in the mid-1970s. The theatre was set up specifically as a marionette stage with front and rear bridges spaced so that puppets could be passed from one operator to another during play, and with 3 feet deep pits that provided space for rod and glove puppets to be presented in the same proscenium. So that's a little bit of history, but back to developing our display. So how often have you heard curators saying that they would like the objects within a display to appear animated? Is this particularly important for objects that have held a performative past? I often deal with this question due to the nature of our collection. The team's objective was to create a display that would enable patrons to appreciate the marionette's performative past and to highlight the active performance, including the role of the puppeteer. We quickly struck upon the idea that one of the ways to do this was to ensure that working components were clearly visible so that the functionality of hand controllers and strings could be understood. This approach contrasts with how marionette puppets are usually viewed during performance, with puppeteers and working components tucked high above the stage on a bridge that is concealed from the audience. In total, 13 puppets were selected from the collection, including 9 marionettes. The other puppets were a combination of hand and rod puppets. The marionettes are constructed from fairly traditional materials: soft, light wood for major body parts, leather joints to articulate movable body parts, and a variety of fabric and foams for the costumes. They had really long cotton strings, approximately 10.5 feet in length, and wooden hand controllers. The faces were a little more complex, with a wooden substructure supporting moulded plastered features, hinged mouths carved out of a harder wood, and often layered with softer, flexible leather components. We worked through the challenges of safely supporting the puppets whilst preserving their whimsical floating qualities. An assessment of the puppet's condition made it clear that the original strings could not be used. However, the original circular metal eyelets that function as attachment points for the strings were sufficiently robust to support the weight of the puppets during the short 5-month display. And in that image on the top right, you can see the eyelet there. Secondary strings in a similar colour would be secured to the original attachment points to support the weight of the puppet. Numerous discussions eventually resulted in the mental shift required to eschew the use of traditional mounts to support the weight of the object from below, but rather rely on the strength of the original material and the attachment points to suspend the puppets. With the team having never worked in this way with puppets before, we quickly realised we would need some external expertise to help us understand how the marionettes were used during performance. Integral to this project was a workshop with a professional puppeteer, Philip Millar, with whom we had an existing relationship through having collected some of his puppets for our collection in the past. Philip helped us to understand the hand controller mechanism and how it can be manipulated during performance. This session informed how we would design our mounts to orientate hand controllers and strings in a way that would support the puppet in a natural stance whilst also providing options to create animated poses. The variation in the stance of the puppet in active mode and non-active mode is clearly visible. As a cautious conservator, you can see me only slightly loosening my grip as Philip played with the hand controller. This workshop was invaluable from a conservation perspective as it reinforced my initial concern about the stress on the original strings when the puppet was suspended from the hand controller. After our workshop with the puppeteer, we met with our Mountmaker Simon to discuss our requirements for flexibility and potential solutions. Ultimately, we landed on a 3-part system. Flexibility was built in by having a horizontal suspension bar that could be placed in the case ceiling tracks in either direction and at any distance from the ends. A movable shuttle support allowed the plate to slide along the length of the bar to easily change the position of the puppet within the case. The plate was designed to be installed to the underside of the shuttle so that we could set the bar and shuttle inside the case prior to introducing the puppet. Each plate was designed specifically for the puppet as the position of the slots had to correspond to the position of the strings as dictated by the controller. For the sake of simplicity, cost, and the short turnaround time of 4 months, we used the same system for each puppet, with the only customisation being the position of the slots in the plate, and you can see that on this next slide. One of the constraints of the install was that it would take place in a public foyer during business hours and that it needed to be completed within a 24-hour period. This meant that our install of each puppet needed to occur in a short time frame and with minimal adjustment once inside the case. To optimise efficiency of install, we decided to set the final position of each puppet inside a test display environment that we set up in our studio. And that's my colleague Joseph inside the case. As we did not yet have our plinths, the testing occurred on a makeshift platform adjusted to the known height of each plinth. The plinths were not required to support the weight of the puppet, but rather they were a design feature and stopped the puppets looking like they were floating in space. Both the original and the support strings were aligned through the slots, but only the support strings were tensioned to take the weight of the puppet and to adjust the position of the puppet. Original strings were wound up and secured on top of the plate without any tension. Three of the marionettes had larger, more complex hand controllers, and this can be seen with Mad Hatter here. These puppets also typically had many more strings and a greater range of movement. The larger hand controllers were suspended from the top of the shuttle, and it was a lot lower, this setup. In testing mode, we just used cotton tape, but then they were later installed with black swage and crimps. We needed a slightly different approach for the White Rabbit. He is much heavier than some of the other puppets. His lower half consists of a solid wooden abdomen and substantial thighs. This additional weight required support from below to display the puppet safely. In this case, we relied upon a combination of the suspension shuttle with plate plus a traditional mount supported by the plinth tabletop. Additionally, the White Rabbit's hands are constructed from moulded latex into which nylon line has been threaded to attach the suspension strings for the hands. Looking at the condition of the latex, it was clear that the attachment point could not be used as the risk of damage to the latex was too high. To satisfy curatorial desire to have the rabbit pose looking at his watch, an armature that could be fixed to the mount was created to raise the rabbit's hand. The armature was very discreet and we tucked it under his jacket, making it barely visible. To facilitate ease of installation, the suspension bars and movable shuttles were installed first in accordance with predetermined locations. The puppets were brought into the foyer with original and support strings already aligned through the slots and secured to the correct length on top of the plate. Once the puppet was in the case, the plate was screwed up into the bottom of the shuttle support. Minor adjustments could be made to the length of the secondary strings to ensure each puppet was supported in its animated pose and that its feet were just skimming the top of the plinth. And yes, before anyone asks, technically the chessboard scene is found in Lewis Carroll's sequel Through the Looking Glass and not Alice in Wonderland, but it was a really effective design element suggested by our director, so we had to go with it. So having the display in the round enhanced the ability to show the working mechanisms of the puppets from all angles. The actual space is very busy with lots of reflective surfaces and atmospheric lighting, however it seemed to all work okay. The black mounts receded nicely into the top of the glass case ceilings. On a sustainability note, all the mount components can be repurposed for future displays, and all the components, including the tabletop plinths and the floor tiles, can be stored flat-packed, which reduces the space required for storage of exhibition hardware, which is always a challenge. We were also able to include some reproductions of archival photographs from when the play was originally staged in 1978, and that just provided some context for the display of how the puppets were used. And that's just another photo. And I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues that were in part of the team. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm a huge Jerry Anderson fan, love the Thunderbirds, the marionettes in there, so these are fantastic. These are even more beautiful, really.
Very beautiful.
I noticed, I think Nancy Ronald was the artist's name. Did she do all of them, or just some of the ones that you showed there? Was she the artist that did all of them?
She was the actual director. Her and her husband were the director of the Puppet Theatre, and so she was the designer and maker of many of the puppets, yes.
Hello. I just had a question about the armature on the rabbit. What was that attached to?
It's just attached to the stalk of the base of the mount. So we just had sort of like a swiveling fitting that attached to the base of the mount, and we could sort of manoeuvre it around to wherever we needed it to be.
I have a question about the support lines that you used that replaced the originals. How did you secure the tension on those, or make like small adjustments?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have a picture showing that part of it, and I knew someone would ask. We had little plastic sections that had a hole in one end, so we actually wound the support strings, the new strings that we attached, around a little plastic fillet, I guess, and then secured them to the top of the plate. So they were only about three very thin sort of wedges, so each turn was a level of adjustment that we could achieve. So it was quite a fine adjustment, but we had them in the case all preset, and then we could just do really minor adjustments once they were inside the case.
We have a question from the virtual audience. They're wondering who made the display case.
The display case?
Yes.
I I don't know if it's a company in America, but they're Tashco display cases, and they come as individual units, about 90 centimetres by 90 centimetres, and then they all go together. So we had 6 cases put together for that particular display.
Thank you.
Thank you.